Welcome to The Next Human. My name's Arav, and today I'm joined by Dr. Gregory Cogan, an assistant professor in neurology at Duke University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Doctor.
Thanks for having me.
Great. And so I guess the first thing I just kind of want to start off with is could you just kind of walk me through your kind of like life story and just kind of tell me, like the things you did and what basically got you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I'll won't start right at the beginning. I'll start, I guess what's relevant for maybe a little bit relevant for you is end of high school. I don't think it's tough to remember. I'm that old. I don't think I knew what I wanted to do then. I was interested in the brain, and I was interested in language. And I think there's still a part of me that thought maybe I would be a lawyer. I think
Hmm.
just because that sort of felt like that's the way life was going to go. And so I did an undergraduate degree in psychology. I went to a university called Queen's University. This is in Canada, where I'm from, and uh, and then I still didn't know what I wanted to do towards the end. And I wrote an undergraduate thesis looking at word length effects and written words in English and Hebrew, because they go left to right or right to left, and they can be used to disassociate behavioral effects of hemisphere dominance for language. And I wrote that, and I really got interested in it, like really interested in it, when I did my thesis defense. And for whatever reason, I was forced to defend the work I'd done. And one of my, people on the committee asked what was probably, I don't remember the question, but it was probably a very normal question, but I remember being very fired up about it. And then just at that moment, I was like, well, this is what I'm going to do. And I then did a master's in linguistics. I was interested in the evolution of language by that point. How come we speak? How come humans speak? And how come, nobody else does? Where did that come from? And I thought it was a super interesting topic, still do. And I went to a conference. This master's program was in the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and very wonderful place. You should go. Anyone should go. It's great.
Hmm.
And there was a conference on the evolution of language, a great conference in Rome. Also, I would recommend if you have to go to a professional conference, Rome is a pretty good place to go to do that.
Imagine.
But yeah, they were very the debates were fiery and contentious about various topics, and I remember thinking that there's no way that you could prove any of these positions, and you all seem very upset about them. And I thought that was strange. And then it sort of got to the point where I said, I'm not sure this field is quite for me, because I feel like at the time anyway, the field was nascent enough that there wasn't a lot of empirical evidence one way or the other.
Hmm.
And which is just fair because language don't fossilize, right? And languages don't fossilize. And so I then did my PhD in neuroscience and cognitive science, thinking that that would be a little more empirical, a little more my style. And I did that at the University of Maryland, and then which was great. That's a great place to study language and auditory and speech. Just a really good place to be. And then my PhD advisor, about halfway through, got a position at New York University and NYU. And so I moved there, and I was still doing my PhD in Maryland, but then was living in New York, which is also fun. And then I stuck around for a number of years and did a postdoc where I first started to do work with intracranial electrodes. So these are electrodes implanted in patients for clinical purposes,
Hmm.
and began working with those kinds of patients to study how the brain works sort of up close. And after that, I moved to Duke for a brief stint as another postdoc for about a year before getting my faculty position at Duke, to sort of continue and build upon the work I had done at NYU, trying to build up a similar research program, but at Duke. and I've been there, been at Duke since. And yeah, so it sort of took me to various different places and, sort of subspecialties, so to speak.
Mhm.
My undergraduate degree was in psychology, and then my master's in linguistics, my PhD was in neuroscience. So I sort of danced around a bit, a little bit. Um, the theme was a little bit common, but it wasn't exactly a straight line.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess, here I am today. That's, I don't know how many years. It's a lot of years
Mhm.
of studying and having some idea of what I want to do, but not necessarily a super clear idea, and just sort of pushing forward and being extremely uh, lucky, to be honest. That's the biggest take home is you should be good and you should be lucky. Those are the two things you need, I think, to be successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I mean, I've heard, from a lot of people before, previous guests and even that just like life kind of, has its way of I don't want to say working out, but just kind of it'll take you through like different paths and everything. And when one door will close, another will open, and um what you're interested in will change, and what you'll do in life will change. And just because you necessarily studied something doesn't mean you'll be doing that as a career or something in the future. And I think well, for one, for me, that's pretty inspiring. I think as um as a high schooler, I mean, I'm kind of like seeing these people, and I'm not really I'm interested in something right now. I'm not too sure if that's going to be what I do in the future, and that can be a little like worrying, I guess, a little, but it's reassuring to know that like I guess people, this is just something that everyone goes through, and you just kind of figure out along the way. And
Yeah, I think that's right.
yeah, and I guess just so um but yeah, wow, that's a pretty cool trajectory, right? Like psychology, linguistics, to neuroscience. And yeah, I guess so. Like, I guess what if I just wanted to ask you, just kind of, could you elaborate more on just what you're doing now at Duke?
Yeah, so we work with what I think is an interesting population, and I'm interested, the lab's interested in studying speech and language. And we sort of try to figure out two things. One is to figure out how the brain does it. So how do you come up with an idea in your head and then translate it into sound? And working backwards, sound is produced. Speech sounds are produced by shaping your oral cavity through your articulators. And what that really means is that you're moving stuff in your mouth, and at the same time you're controlling your breathing to let air out very slowly, which is an underemphasized part of speech. Animals don't typically do that. They can't control the rate of breath, but you're controlling your breathing. Your tongue is moving around, your lips are moving around very quickly to make these speech sounds.
Mhm.
In order to do those speech sounds, you need to have a plan for those. And so you need to put a bunch of sounds together in a sequence that then maps onto a word that you know and maybe love. And those words string together to form a sentence, and that sentence has, syntactic structure, grammatical structure, but it also means something, and that all came from an idea. And, the rate at which you do this is on the order of milliseconds, hundreds of milliseconds. So, under a second, you're doing all this effortlessly every day, and you're conveying ideas, maybe your love of poems or Shakespeare or something, or, you're pointing at a dog that looks funny. I mean, you do all these things just effortlessly. And so how do you do that? How does the brain do? And so we're interested in understanding how that works. And then the other thing we're trying to do, similar kind of field of study, but we're trying to develop devices that restore speech for people who have lost this ability. So patients who suffer from ALS or locked-in syndrome, and even sometimes, like conditions like Parkinson's, you can slowly lose your ability to speak as well.
Mhm.
So they've lost this ability to speak, and the sort of hit on the quality of life, as you can imagine, is just really, really bad, tremendous. And you know, historically devices that attempt to restore communication have been a little bit cumbersome and slow. But lately, we've just seen this huge push towards devices that read these neural signals that are correspond to different aspects of speech in the brain, and then convert those signals into sounds. And the idea then is that you can restore this ability. And so we're sort of developing devices and technology and validating this technology to be able to do that. And so we work to do this. We work with some interesting patient populations. Some of the patients have, like I mentioned before, electrodes implanted directly in their brain, and that's not something that's generally allowable for research purposes for obvious reasons. And so these patients have electrodes, but they're for clinical purposes, primarily for epilepsy. And so epilepsy is a brain disorder in which there's sort of this huge amount of activity that occurs in sort of almost like an avalanche seizure, right?
Yeah.
And about 30% of patients who have suffered from epilepsy are pharmacologically resistant, meaning that medication doesn't work. So you try medication, that doesn't work. You try another one, that doesn't work. And usually if you try 2 or 3, it's not gonna work, unfortunately. And so in order to treat those patients, one option can be surgical resection, where they can remove the part of the brain that's causing seizures. But in order to figure out where that part is, they need to monitor seizure activity and figure out where seizures are coming from. And so that's when they stick electrodes in, and they have patients in the monitoring unit, which is the hospital bed, for about a week. And these patients are lying around waiting to have seizures so they can figure out where they're coming from, and they graciously agree to participate in our studies, our language tasks, speech tasks. And so they repeat things, they listen to things, they push buttons, and then we can monitor their brain activity related to these things and learn something about the brain. And the other kind of patients we work with, where we use sort of more developed or electrodes that we're developing in-house. So these are electrodes that have lots and lots of contacts. Typically electrodes have maybe standard grids have about 64 electrodes, and they're about a centimeter apart. And the ones we're developing, my colleague, Dr. John Viventi, is developing, have, I think, 1,000 channels, millimeter apart. And so what that means is that we can measure signals on the brain, a lot more of them, and a lot closer together, so we can get a better picture of what's happening in the brain at millisecond resolution, which can help us learn about speech and develop better tools to restore speech. And for those devices, because they're novel and new, we can't, again, just go putting them in willy-nilly. And so some patients, like for instance, for epilepsy patients, if they're cutting out that part of the brain that's causing seizures and they're worried that that part is near a part of the language center in the brain, in the operating room itself, they'll wake a patient up. They'll have them do like a picture naming task, typically, where you show a picture, you have to say what it is, and they'll stimulate. And if the stimulate the brain, disrupts that picture naming, then they'll mark it so they don't cut out that bit. So when patients wake up and they have part of their brain removed that's causing seizures, they also can still speak. That's the goal. And so while these patients are awake, we can put these sort of new fancy electrodes right on their brain and have them say some stuff for us for about 10 minutes or so in the operating room itself. And so that's how we get our data, those two sort of interesting avenues. And then those are the two goals that we're trying to sort of accomplish, trying to understand how the brain works, and then also restore the ability to speak for patients who have lost it. And I have tons of great colleagues and very supportive, including very supportive neurosurgical colleagues who really help make all this possible. So it's I think interesting work, and it's busy, as you can imagine.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think it's interesting for one too. And I think, well, for one, I'm not too up to date on my brain science, but I think I read somewhere that well, for one, the brain's pretty complicated, obviously, but like in general, like the left side of the brain is more associated with language center. I think more specifically, like I think Broca's area or something it's called. And so That's, I guess, like that's what you guys are studying, right? Like the language centers of the brain.
Yeah, yeah, and so that the Broca's area or the inferior frontal gyrus is been thought to be an important part of language production for over 100 years. The interesting thing about Broca's area is that if you remove it, again, say for well, probably not for epilepsy, but usually certainly like for a low-grade glioma, for instance, like a tumor. Um, uh, Patients will have transient mutism, meaning they won't be able to speak, but in a couple of days they'll get it back and they'll be more or less fine long term. So there's this kind of weird sort of split between models that say, hey, this is really important, and
Yeah.
then clinical work where it's like, actually, we can just get rid of it and everything is fine. And so sort of highlights the fact that, like, even though we have these models and we think we know what we're doing, there's always a mystery.
Yeah.
And so, but you're exactly right that these kinds of things, where does language occur and what exactly is occurring in them? Language is not a monolithic thing, right? There are different aspects of it. There's differences in syntax or meaning or, phonology, the sounds that we use, that kind of thing. And so we're trying to figure out, what are the underlying things that the computations that the brain is doing to allow for something as complex as language.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's complicated, but hopefully we're making progress.
No, I think it's super cool. But yeah, I mean, like the extent of my the knowledge in neuroscience goes to, I think, what was the name? Phineas Gage, I think that
Oh
story
yeah, yeah,
about,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that pipe straight through. And yeah, I mean, I think that that's pretty much all I know. And I think that's it's cool. I mean, I think
Hmm.
one, that the brain is so elastic, and also just kind of how, well, obviously we use it every day, and it's like it's um just how important it is and how little we know about it. And I think, like, it seems, I mean, I'm sure you'd be able to give a better statement on this, but it just kind of seems like every time we think we know something about the brain, um it goes around and like flips on us, and it turns out like, no, it does this too or something.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, that's what keeps it exciting. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's still full of mystery
Hmm.
but again, that's what keeps things sort of interesting and keeps us moving forward and try to, figure at least some of the stuff out.
Yeah. And I mean, so on the work you were doing with um I forget, but it was just basically like, taking um the signals from the brain and just kind of, I guess, in a way, like translating into speech, basically. Like, I guess my question would be, how does that work? Because that sounds, for one, like really cool, and also just, I think, um something that would help a lot of people, and to live um more typical lives.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And so there's also been a lot of interest in this field and then maybe some apprehension based on whether or not these kinds of devices are reading minds and stuff like that, which is fair. So I mentioned at the beginning, when we speak, you're taking some kind of idea or ideas and getting it out into sound. And there are a bunch of different stages that have to happen for that to be possible. And so the way technology works really across the field right now is that we record in the motor cortex and speech motor cortex. And that really represents like the last part of that process before signals get sent to the articulators in your mouth to speak. And so it's not so much that these devices are reading thoughts, it's they're reading the motor commands to send to your mouth to move things around. And so we're really piggybacking off of that. And so we read those signals and you train a model that can convert neural signals into what the mouth is doing, and can be used to predict what is happening at any given point in time, and then that can get converted from there into acoustic speech. And there are various for instance, or written text. And there are different ways of doing this. We read those, like I said, the speech motor movements, and translate those into the motor movements before converting it into sound. But other places just go straight to the sound. And some people go from brain signals to words directly, and that's another way people have done it. And so there are lots of different ways of approaching this problem, but fundamentally, the signals that are being read are pretty much the same across the board, and that it's the motor signals that are sent to your mouth as you're going to speak. There is some work, but it's less like ready for prime time, so to speak, but still extremely cool, that can measure signals more associated with meaning. And so one day, hopefully, we'll be able to do more of that. But we're a little bit further away from being able to read, ideas and converting it to speech, right, as opposed to motor movement. And it could be more useful for that kind of approach if, for instance, the part of your brain that sends signals to your mouth is damaged, right? And so there we want to maybe go back a little further in the sort of ordering and see if we can tap into something a bit further back. And that's something we're thinking about, but also, thankfully, so are other people as well.
So I think I see what you're saying. I think it'd be kind of sort of like, I mean, I'm not like consciously, or I'm not aware of the signals, my brain is sending to my mouth to talk right now. But for someone who's, like facial muscles are like degraded or something, they can't, the articulators aren't working, I guess. They would still be able to, I guess, speak in a way, and that this would basically convert the signals that their brain is sending to their mouth and their tongue and everything is into speech.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. And people have shown that, even people who can barely speak or not speak still have like good enough brain signals in their motor cortex, the part of the brain that sends signals to the mouth, that they can, these signals can be read and converted to speech. So that's another good thing. But at some point, as the field gets more developed, and we're trying to help more and more people with various different kinds of disorders. I think as the more aspects of the brain and it composing speech that we can read, the better off we'll be for more people.
Yeah, so I think that's what you're saying about like the like not ready for prime time research. There's like that
Yeah.
taking I guess that would be more into the mind reading side, right? Like taking ideas themselves and concepts and making words from those.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
It's not that far off, I think, but I haven't seen anyone do it yet. But soon, presumably.
That's cool. Maybe you could spearhead it.
Yeah. Yeah. The part of the thing of training these models and really any model is that you need lots and lots and lots and lots of data. And one of the things that we do, by recording in the operating room, we don't get lots of data for understandable reasons. The patient has a hole in their head and, they're trying to operate. And so we usually get a little bit of data. And so we're trying to develop ways where we can combine different patients together, to try to build better models. But the stuff that I've seen with these meaning decoding is, hours and hours of data. And so I think that's going to be part of the next step, is trying to figure out how to do more with less. And so, yeah, I mean, hopefully we can, but there are lots of logistics,
Yeah.
aspects involved.
And yeah, I mean that makes sense. And I guess on medical devices part of your research, I think you were saying about, sorry, could you just read what you were saying?
Yeah, so the devices that we're using, again, are sort of designed by my colleague and friend, Dr. John Viventi, who's a associate professor in biomedical engineering. So standard, um, they're called grid electrodes because they're shaped like a grid, and they have historically been used, again, to monitor epilepsy, but obviously can be used for other things. And they have, they have different electrodes on the grid so that you can measure different spots in the brain. And they have usually about 64 channels or electrodes, and they can measure 64 separate spots in the brain, and they're about a centimeter apart. And which is, useful, and you get a coarse kind of sense of what's going on. But the ones that we're developing have, upwards of 1,000 channels or more electrodes, and then the spacing is about a millimeter apart. And we're continuing to, develop devices that are even have more electrodes and, closer together even. But this gives us a much sort of more high definition view of the brain. We've shown in recent work that when you compare, these electrodes with devices with lots of electrodes, and you compare it to devices that don't have a lot, you do a lot better being able to figure out, what the brain, in our case, is doing when you speak. And so this is going to help, I think, future, devices to help patients speak again, because there's just more information from that you're recording from the brain.
That makes
And
sense.
so we're
Yeah.
pretty excited about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of just, um, yeah, in essence, just getting more data. Um,
Yeah.
that helps in everything, I guess. And yeah, I mean, so when you say, I mean, so you're talking about like machine learning models, and I think um, the role that I guess the growing role that machine learning is playing is clearly, I guess, making a pretty big dent in the field of neuroscience. I mean, how have you seen that um, transition, I guess? I mean, has it always been like this, or is it becoming more prevalent?
Yeah, it's definitely more prevalent. So, like in our work, you do better using nonlinear machine learning models than if you use linear models. And so that's a an obvious thing. And for the kind of work that we're doing, it's really important because you can do a lot better at predicting, especially with like words, of what's going to come next, using again these nonlinear machine learning models, and it is new. And so, when I was a PhD student, I mean, no one really talked about this as being an option for anything. And so I think we've really made huge advances as a field, and certainly on the engineering side, it's extremely useful. On the neuroscience side, it can be very useful, but takes a little more work to make it be useful, because you can lose some interpretability, right? So if you stick a whole bunch of data into a complex model and something gets spit out, you don't necessarily know how it did it or what it's doing.
Yeah.
And this is true in any field, but in neuroscience as well. And so there are lots of people out there who are doing extremely good work using machine learning models, deep neural nets, and trying to model how the brain works, and doing just really amazing work. And then sometimes, you can use it and just not learn a lot about stuff. Um, and so on the, hey, we want to know about the brain side, as opposed to the, let's build a tool side. The learning part, I think these tools have to be used a bit more carefully. But there's no question that they offer huge advantages. Just
Mhm.
sometimes they're not as easy to understand what
Yeah.
is going on, because they're complex.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and I guess in that case, I mean I guess the name of the game is data, right? I think like um that's yeah, that's a pretty interesting point you brought up, that like even if we have these models, like how useful they're, like what they tell us is also just kind of depends. And um the brain itself is just something that's so like volatile and not, but there's so many signals that get sent around, and so quickly that it's just kind of hard to make sense of them, I guess. And I think in that sense, yeah, I think like the more data we have, um the better we'd be able to, understand what these signals mean, and um which in which like the electrode you guys are working on definitely would help. And then we can take all that, that we've learned from there and bring it to um application. And I think like the work you're doing with the speech conversion, I guess, is kind of in that sense um application. And I think that's amazing. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we're trying, and there are lots of other people in the field too that are just doing
Mhm.
really great work, and it's really exciting to be a part of it, to be honest, and just seeing what comes out. I mean, I'm as excited as I'm sure you are whenever I see people doing cool things. I'm like, oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And so it's just really exciting to be in a field that I think is really taking off.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, but thanks.
Yeah, I mean, so I think we're just about wrapping up. Yeah, time's pretty much running out. But yeah, I just wanted to finish off with the last question. So what is one piece of advice you'd give to um I said high schoolers, but just pretty much anyone, honestly, who's looking to be getting into neuroscience, or just, I mean, in general, going through the wonderful game of life. Uh so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a great question. And I think, especially for someone like your age who's, sounds like it's going to go off to university. I think and it's a good emphasis to think about the thing you're studying. Like, what do I want to study? What sort of, body of knowledge do I want to have access to, or skill set do I want to come out of this with? And, it can be based on your interest, or maybe it's based on much more practical matters. You're like, oh, I'm going to do this to get a job. And those are all great things to think about and important. But what I think gets overlooked a lot is um, one of the main points of going to university is learning how to think, how to solve a problem, how to think about conceptually a different thing, how to tackle, a multi-stage process, and how to keep track of things, and what's a good idea, how do you come up with an idea, what counts as evidence, how do I develop things to support that, all those kinds of meta skills that sometimes get lost in the shuffle. And I think it's important to think about your education, whatever it's in, as both, I need to learn the skills that are important to the field I'm interested in, but also how do I tackle problems? And I, you know, I know lots of people in my field who are very good technically, but maybe don't necessarily know how to push things forward. And I know people who have lots of wonderful ideas and maybe don't have the means to do it. And so I would sort of emphasize that it's really important, as best you can, to try to think about both aspects. And so that would be my advice is and especially for people who are maybe more interested in engineering, don't lose sight of the problem solving aspect. And if you're interested in maybe philosophy or something, I'd say also maybe learn some practical skills that, so you can apply your ideas.
Mhm. Great. Well, so thank you for that advice. And thank you again for joining me on the podcast today. Yeah, it was wonderful to have you on.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope I answered at least some of your questions. And I was really, enjoyed being here. And yeah, thanks so much.